Are back once again for a interview, a behind the scenes look of the Self-Employed Life podcast. So you get to get the content several weeks before it will broadcast as a podcast, as well as, hey, there might be some flubs and what have you. So it can be a little bit more fun too. So we are going to dive into today's conversation, which is going to be excellent. What do we tend to center our business goals around? Revenue, right? In this episode, find out why that might not be the best idea and what to do differently. Eleanor Beaton is the founder of Safi Media, an education and coaching company for women entrepreneurs. Safi Media is committed to advancing global gender equity, one woman-owned business at a time. Together with her colleagues, Eleanor is on a mission to double the number of women entrepreneurs who scale past $1 million in revenue by 2030. Eleanor hosts the Power Plus Presence Plus Position podcast. That's a tongue twister. A top-rated podcast for female founders with over 1.7 million downloads to date. The former chair of the Visiting Women's Executive Exchange Program at the Yale School of Management, Eleanor has been featured in publications including the Globe and Mail, the Atlantic, and Forbes. Welcome, Eleanor.
It's so great to be here with you. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation for, so many reasons, but I certainly love the focus that you have on women entrepreneurs. But hey, you men listening in, don't be discouraged because the information applies to you too, But we will talk in our conversation about why is this maybe a unique experience for women entrepreneurs. And it pleases me because by and large, in many avenues of my own coaching practice, I coach far more women than I do men. On social media and other platforms, it tends to be almost 50-50. But I think there are some unique aspects which we'll talk about as well. But what I want to do, though, before we talk, as we will in a moment, exactly as I had said, why we don't want a revenue goal at the center of our business, I think it'd also be really valuable to understand a little bit about your origin story and how you came to this conclusion. So if you can share with us a little bit of your background, your origin story, and how you came to your own awareness that a revenue-centered goal business was a challenge.
It's so interesting. My story, the reason why I am so passionate about helping women entrepreneurs to advance and really advancing global gender equity, one woman-owned business at a time, started back in my childhood. So I grew up in rural Canada. We immigrated to Canada from the UK. My dad was Welsh. My mother was from the Fiji Islands. When they first met, she was the breadwinner in the family. My dad worked for the Fijian government. He went over there after university. He was working for the Fijian government. He loves to tell us for $9 a week. So he would have to go like spear fishing to supplement. My mom was a teacher. So we moved to Canada. The culture is completely different. The language is completely different. And my mother doesn't feel comfortable putting me in daycare. I was like 3 or 4 at the time. So she becomes a stay-at-home mom. And it was a really important decision for our family, both positive and negative, because it actually rendered her financially disempowered. So even though she and my father had a great marriage, long-lasting marriage until he died about 10 years ago, they were happy. They had a healthy marriage in many ways. The one sticking point was always money. And specifically how to use money. So my mom had agency in all kinds of areas in her life, but not financially. And I can remember one day she's driving me to basketball practice. She's PO'd. She's gripping the steering wheel. Her knuckles are white. And she says to me, Eleanor, money is power. Always make your own. Now, this was like a fire in the belly moment. And for somebody who works with entrepreneurs, like fire in the belly is a really important oomph, like energy source that we need. And so I became extremely determined and motivated that I was always going to be financially independent. But as I started building my business, what I noticed was that sometimes taking short money-making decisions compromised long-term growth. And I'll give you an example. My first business I started, it was a consulting business. I sold communications consulting. I traded dollars for hours. And I started this company at the same time as this guy, Elliot, who's a friend of mine. He was a graphic designer. So we'd often get teamed up by our clients on projects. We both ran those businesses for 10 years. But he had access to this network of people who were telling him to make big long-term moves. I didn't have access to these people, and I just went one contract to the next. Flash forward 10 years, both of us are kind of tired of the businesses that we're running. I have nothing to sell. I have to shut my business down. He has created this extraordinary asset that he sells that gives him seed capital to start his next business that I predict put him about 10 years financially ahead of me. So this is where it started. It was both the drive to be financially independent and that firsthand experience of how the hunt for immediate revenue can hold us back from making good long-term decisions that actually create sustainable long-term wealth.
Yeah, I love the thread in that story, right? It speaks to a fundamental truth so often, is that what works for us also works against us, right? So that fire in the belly that your mother showed you to have financial independence then set you on a course of chasing the revenue. And in doing so, as you describe so well in your work, and in fact, you tell us, because I love the way you describe it, like what does that feel like? What's the downside when you have a business where, and again, we're going to talk in a moment about breaking down like the difference between revenue and sales and cash, because all these words can kind of collapse.
Yeah.
But what are the consequences of this revenue sort, and how do you define revenue? Like, how are you defining it? What is the ball that you were chasing? And what was the consequence of chasing that ball?
Yeah. So what I was really the ball that I was chasing, and when I really look at it, it was monthly revenue and annual revenue. So I was looking at how much money did I bring in this month? And is this going to allow me to hit my annual goal? And how can I make that number bigger every month? And that was this. And, there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it was what I wasn't thinking about instead. So what I wasn't thinking about are, what's the long-term sustainability of this? How long can I do this? How much energy is getting put into this? Is there something here that's going to allow me to not inject this amount of labor that I'm putting into this in order to create the same amount of revenue or more revenue? So what it felt like, what it really felt like was pneumonia. I mean, I can remember it was the peak of that business. I had 2 young boys. I was often there, but not there, during family time and meals, because my income really depended on my labor. And I can remember I had this massive project, and, because I was continuing to be ambitious. And so I still had that fire, money is power. And so I was continuing to take on bigger projects that were more complex, that paid better, but put an enormous amount of pressure on me. And so I took on this project for the celebrity client. And there were a group of us working on it, and it wasn't going well. And I can remember being at the Phoenix airport. I'm on my way to this retreat. It was this one island of me time in a year of just slugging away. And I'm already starting to get sick because I'm overworking. And I get this email, and one of those emails where it's basically like, you suck, this sucks, fix it. And I can feel the life force draining out of me. And I missed my kids. I missed my husband. I felt so small. And I was feeling extremely sick too. God help the people who were around me. I didn't realize I had pneumonia, but I did.
Yeah.
But I just, it was in that moment that I was like, I have to create a business that takes a longer term view. And, it's interesting, like now, I do a lot of work in, with the ecosystem that supports women founders, and I'm on the board of a venture capital organization and so on. And one of the things that we see is that, investors who are looking to invest in businesses, like unsophisticated investors will often look at a business and be like, well, how much monthly recurring revenue is it making? It's like the spreadsheet. Really sophisticated investors understand it's about the vision. It's about the ability to put in the assets to create a truly scalable business.
Yeah.
And that in order to do that, you're often making decisions that might not make sense in the short term.
Yeah. But I always say about entrepreneurship, a lot of people struggle with this, is that we're always holding more than one truth at the same time.
Oh,
Right.
preach.
Always. So the fact of the matter is that, first of all, when you switch to longer term thinking, when you're less focused on the revenue of that month and you shift your thinking to thinking long term, I'll tell you what, the biggest benefit that I think is that it removes a sense of urgency. Urgency is what wears us down physically because your body is in a constant state of fight or flight. So the urgency, because if every month there's a goal, you're putting yourself in a constant state of urgency. So if you can start thinking, when you shift your mindset to thinking longer term, you take away the urgency. Okay. So that just makes you feel so much better. While at the same time, I think what shifts when you shift to long-term thinking is that your monthly goals perhaps are then become markers, a little bit less emotionally attached, right? You're a
Totally.
lot, right? And that's a big difference. So that's why I'm saying you're holding both. It's like those monthly goals or short-term quarterly goals, whatever shorter term goals you're setting for yourself become markers as to whether you're going towards the longer term goal. But when it's not the center of your being, you remove the urgency from it. And I think that is a way, that we're holding both. But I think I can only imagine people listening are thinking, okay, so if it's not a revenue focused centered business, if it's not a monthly centered, what is it? So what do you suggest? And I
Yeah.
know you have the answer to this. What are we centering it around? How are we thinking?
Well, I think it becomes, from the perspective of the entrepreneur, I think there is a switch that we make where we go from being like big game hunters to gardeners, and that was a switch. So, a lot of us, when we're first starting our business, we have to be quote unquote hunters. So we really do need, our businesses are, they live and die on cash flow. Nobody in our industry or in the industries that most of us would be in, I believe, are going to be starting companies that are going to get a ton of venture capital. So cash flow and our ability to sell, is key. So that's where a lot of us start. And then making that transition, of going out and hunting every day and going out and hunting and bringing something back to the cave has to switch to, okay, I'm going to focus on planting a garden here. So I'm going to think about having like an orchard and having apple trees, and I'm going to prune those trees. And so the harvest is a clear end goal, and that's your revenue, right? But picking the apples is just one piece of an ecosystem that a farmer is thinking about. She is thinking about the quality of the trees that she plants. She's thinking about a proper irrigation system. She's thinking about doing what she needs to do to make sure that the soil is prepared. She's doing what she needs to do to make sure that they're fertilized properly, that there are systems in place to make sure that bugs and all the things that impact them aren't taking root, right? So the harvest is an important critical part, but it's not seen as the only part. So inside a business, what started happening to me when I allowed myself to trust, because in the beginning I did have to hunt. I did have to be very focused on making money because that was the initial stages of the business. When I allowed myself to trust, okay, look, you know how to do this. So I had to talk to myself and coach myself. Why don't you allow that to kind of go, and let's turn your attention to what would be another piece of infrastructure or an asset that you can create. And so that became a scalable offer. That became a really effective selling system. That became some core marketing assets. That became some key partnerships. And so it's like really sort of plotting out different key pieces of an ecosystem, and we've really identified sort of 5 key systems, key pieces of a service-based ecosystem that are quite important to have. And when you start focusing on building those, the revenue becomes a natural byproduct.
Correct. It's funny, without knowing that you and I would be having this conversation a couple months ago, I wrote an article for Entrepreneur Magazine which was just recently published. But of course, I've written it a couple months ago before it actually makes its way to the being published. And it's what I refer to as the difference between an impact business model versus an income-based business model, for almost the very same reason that you're saying. Because as I teach my students, and then this is how it came up. It came up because in the previous cohort of the Self-Employed Business Institute, when I taught this class on impact business model, I walked away from the class not feeling like I really made my point. Like they understood what to do, but I felt like I didn't make the point as to why this was important for self-employed business owners versus a traditional business. And I realized it's because innately self-employed businesses are owned by people who are purpose-driven, heart-centered. They're doing something they're deeply passionate about. Therefore, our desire for impact comes before our desire for the income. And the fact matter is, in order to build that business, there are several activities. One of the examples I give is being a speaker. If you aspire to be a speaker on stages because you're going to have a big impact on people's lives, you're going to be for years putting a lot more energy into building that than it would ever be rewarded by income. Eventually, so your message about trust there, that's why I'm bringing this up. I think your message about trust is really important to understand when you are in business, probably just by nature being self-employed. But in addition to it, if you're a thought leader or a subject matter expert, it's just part of the process where you're going to lead with impact, which is why understanding an impact business model is better, so that you are making decisions on your business based on what you trust will be income generating later on, and not what's bringing in income at the moment, so that you have the results you want. I honestly, I hadn't really heard anybody else speak about this idea of impact business model. When I wrote the article, I was kind of making up the terminology for it.
Yeah.
But I love the fact you're on a common theme, right?
Yes.
That to me validates it. It's like, for those of us that have been in business for a while and have gone through the cycle from hunting to gardening, we can tell you that the rewards in your business come when you start thinking longer term, when you start planting the seeds for the income that's going to find its way to you in future years. You just have to trust it.
Absolutely. You know, and it's so interesting. Like, I always think about what I am experiencing today is a direct result of what I did last quarter, the quarter before that, and the year before that. You know, our current reality is often, or big parts of our current reality in business are often actually a lag indicator.
Yeah, and we do not, and we don't like to hear that. You know, I mean, I've shared, I think, here on the podcast before, because a member of my team, when we were building out the systems to enroll students in the Self-Employed Business Institute, everything he was doing, he kept saying, what I'm doing now is going to help the Business Institute fill itself in 2 years. I'm like, 2 years? I need students for this cohort.
Don't tell me that.
Right. He's like, but you'll thank me in 2 years. It was the hardest thing to hear. And again, it's not an either or, it's a yes and. I mean, I had to turn towards my closest circle of influence to fill up the first cohort.
Yes.
But everything we do has 2 and 3 years in mind, because this is not a short-term thing I'm building. This is a very long-term thing I'm building. My legacy, it's something that will outlive me. So therefore, it does make sense to think longer term and think about it. I like I would tell you to write that book, To Go From Hunter to Gardener. I think it's a great business book.
Oh, that's a good, yes.
Right?
I need to write that one down.
Yeah, I would love to see you write that book, because it really does represent, it's a great metaphor how, like I've read in some of your content, like, you know, in the hunting, we had to go out, find the meal, drag it back to the cave, you know, and that is what it feels like in the early start of businesses. But when you transition to having a sustainable business is when your mindset shifts to gardening instead of thinking like a hunter. You also, one of the things that I think would be so valuable for everybody to hear about is, I kind of called it your 30% rule. You actually don't call it that, but I know you know what I mean, that there's this 30%. So could you go through that?
Yeah. So this came from, this idea came from Outrage. Outrage is actually can be very constructive. Exactly. It's a fuel. So I was at a conference for startups, and it was a very tech-based conference. And as I started telling people what I did, I could immediately see their eyes kind of glaze over, and they're like, oh, that's a lifestyle business. And I was like, what are you? I make more money than you do, employ more people. Like, you're doing nothing except asking investors for money for, let's face it, a business model that's going to fail in 2 years, as will most of the people here. In fact, this entire room represents the biggest waste of money that's happening in our economy right now. I was mad. Okay. I was mad. So if you've received venture, like, it's fine. So, but I thought about something, and all of those businesses there, even though most of them would not be in business, most of that venture capital would go nowhere. They were startups on a mission to become a unicorn. And so a unicorn, as some listeners may know, is a company that has $1 billion valuation. And it was the ability to articulate and to name and define a clear destination. And without that, our companies can be written off as lifestyle businesses, which is not a compliment. It's like in the South when people say "bless your heart" and you think it's being nice, but it's not.
We've had whole conversations about that. We'll come back to that because I hate the fact that that's seen in such a derogatory light. Like, I'm out to change that. I'm out to it to be a compliment for people to say you have a lifestyle business because, so we'll come back to that. That's my rage.
Right, exactly. And so so I was like, well, what is it? Or what is it that we're trying to create? And so I really went through, if you've been like working with clients and founders for a long time, you're going to have a lot of data. And so we had a lot of data about what did the women entrepreneurs that we were working with, what did they want? And they wanted 3 things. They wanted cash, as in money. They wanted influence, the ability to have their voices heard, and they wanted autonomy, freedom, and space to pursue life on their terms. And so the business had to create those things. So I was like, what's a business that allows those things? And then we really started looking, and this came from the women themselves who had created businesses that permitted. And we started to identify a couple of key things. One, their businesses were set up in such a way that they were growing often at a rate of about 30% a year, plus or minus. Sometimes they would choose to accelerate, sometimes decelerate. That can be a hard growth thing to sustain for some time, but many self-employed people will be able to make this happen. So it's not like 10xing, right? But it's like an ambitious but reasonable 30% profitability, because the company needs to have internally generated cash flow to set up a financial fortress for the founder to reinvest in growth. So that's the second 30. And then one of the most important ones, which is 30% open time. So this is 30% time that the founder, as you have articulated, are often very impact driven. To do that, you need energy. You need to be able to think deeply. You need space to connect. And that's where this 30% open time is. So that's what we call it the jewel business. 30, 30, 30.
I know you call it the jewel business. I love, and I think it's such an important, I actually want to reiterate because it's one of the more clear cut, people ask all the time, well, they always want a range. Often people are, how much should I grow? What's good? What's,
Totally.
What's an average number of podcast listeners? Like, people are always looking for some kind of a range, and it's often really hard to give. But I have to say, I think this is really accurate. So I'm going to reiterate that, for your business to be growing and sustainable, what you're trying for is 30% increase in cash every year. Increase your profitability every year. And unfortunately, that often starts going the other way, but actually you should be increasing your profitability for your services by 30% every year. And you should be gaining 30% more free time every year. I think that 30%, I think you're spot on. And now, do people achieve that? No, like I said, when it comes to profitability, particularly as a business is growing, often, what used to be a 50% margin is now a 20% margin, right? It often goes the other way. That's why I think this is really important. Actually, everything should be going in a 30% forward direction, 30% more cash, 30% more profitability on your services, 30% more free time. That's how you keep a business going and growing, and not the whole 10x thing, which is
it's just it doesn't do. I mean, to me, that can often be irresponsible scaling. And we've seen that and I don't judge people for that, because I think it can happen, especially if the market itself is elevating. Like, I certainly saw during the pandemic things like, architects, home designers, like builders, that industry went through the roof, and suddenly they're swamped with demand. The company is growing, they're doing their best, but would you call it responsible scaling?
Yeah.
Like,
Or is it sustainable?
or
I mean,
sustainable.
none of us, I mean, hey, if you're in business for yourself, you didn't do this and that harkens back to lifestyle, which talk about, and I want to go back to in a moment. But most self-employed people are not building a business upfront knowing that they're going to sell it.
No,
I always
that's
say
true.
that's a little bit more
Yeah,
entrepreneurship,
yeah.
where you're building to sell. Most self-employed businesses have started a business for the long haul. This isn't something like technology you're building up for 2 years and going to flip it. Right. So it usually tends to be a longer term, which is why I come back to lifestyle. Like, I don't understand, and I would love to see the whole terminology change around the criticism of a lifestyle business. Because if you're building a business that is providing you with a lifestyle that you dream of, good for you. Like,
Yes.
that's a lifestyle business. I mean, I will always say I absolutely have a lifestyle business because for 40 years, I have let my business support the lifestyle I want. I've made every decision I've ever done needed in business based on the lifestyle I want, not the other
Mm.
way around. I don't let my business drive me. I let the lifestyle I want drive my business decisions.
You need to be a keynote speaker
I
at
am.
those I know, at those tech conferences. That
Yeah.
message,
Oh, they don't want to hear it though.
I know, they need it. Like, they really need it. Yeah.
Yeah, what people need and what they're willing to hear are
Yeah.
often two different things.
That's so true.
I'll get pelted with widgets. I can just
You
imagine
will.
what's going to be
Exactly. A
thrown at
couple
me, right?
smartphones
Yeah,
flying through the air.
exactly. So let's talk then about, as I said early on, I wanted to also concentrate on like what about this is unique in your experience for women business owners. And I believe there
Mm,
is. And I loved even the impact of your mother talking about financial independence and
yeah.
the fact that Elliot went off and made different decisions you did. There's a lot of social influence there by nature of being a woman and how you interpreted your mother's message and what the society is telling you. So, and you've decided to niche right down and make
Yeah.
this your goal, right? So what do you see as some of the unique aspects for women business owners that you really want to get through to them?
I think one thing that I have seen women struggle with is the ability to divorce uh, their value, their value in the market, from being very hands-on with clients. So I have certainly seen this happen. This was something that I certainly struggled with more than, say, Elliot did. And it's something that I have seen, in working with many women entrepreneurs that I haven't seen struggle to the same extent, with men, for instance. And it's this idea that sometimes as women, where there's this big conditioning and tie to our value being connected to our labor. And so as you start to create an ecosystem and put in place assets that allow you to, like your Self-Employed Business Institute, that allow you to very effectively serve multiple clients at a high level at once, but they don't all have the same amount of hands-on attention that you do if you're doing one-to-one, it's okay. Like, the value isn't about your one-to-one relationship and connection. Can you allow the value that you to create to come from your intellectual property, to come from the assets, to come from the processes, to come from the team that you build? And so I think that is something that has been really huge, like that ability and having upfront and open conversations as women about how we start to renegotiate our value in the business as it grows and as we're not as hands-on and connected as maybe we once were.
Yeah.
So I think that's really key. And then there's just this other part, around conversations about thinking big, about creating assets, about using wealth as a tool to generate more growth. So using money as a growth asset rather than just something that we then go and take for ourselves. So sometimes there's a risk aversion to investing in growth that can happen. I will see people who, and I'm all about coaching, right? But I'll see people who will pay $60,000 a year in coaching, but won't hire a full-time assistant, or like a full-time And so it's just sort of these conversations, which is not wrong, but I'm just saying I think there is space among women entrepreneurs to have very practical conversations about assets, about the use of cash as fuel to grow, and about renegotiating our true value in our businesses.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that you brought up, and I'm glad you did for even my own benefit. How I can imagine how often women attach a monetary value to their time, maybe more than men do, right? Because, if you think about the difference between heart and head, right? Men are probably residing in their head a little bit more. So, like, you're going to pay for my genius. There's this
Yeah.
whole other ego which developed from the head. There becomes a different attachment to it. That's a really interesting point. And because I
Mm.
coach predominantly women,
Yeah.
I would agree. I've seen that, and you've just
Yeah.
equipped me to actually have a deeper understanding of it and help them through that. But I think there is a deeper attachment to their time and the value of their time than perhaps that men do.
Mhm.
How as someone who's been on this journey so much for yourself, and now you're really developing a community and kinship of women that really need each other, and I think that's
Mhm.
really important for you in your journey towards your own success. How alienated did it feel to you? I mean, what did you, and is that part of the craving and the need that you feel that women need to come together as a community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, a woman with a well articulated point of view, a courageous heart, a bias to action, and strong boundaries, a woman who really has the willingness to stand up, uh, value herself, charge her worth, plus tax and adjustments for inflation, you know,
I love
um,
that.
that is a woman like that is going to create a reaction, both a positive reaction, and we see that all the time, like support and people who want to come into your world, and also can trigger people close to her. You know,
Mhm.
um, may trigger people who supported who she was, but not necessarily who she's becoming. And so I think that that to me has been the key around community. Like as women change, and especially as we dramatically change, and anyone who is self-employed, you're highly creative with a bias to action, which means that you transform quickly. As you are pursuing your goals, and I think that for many women, as we start to change in that way, the thing that may hold us back is this question of how is this going to impact our relationships with our family, with our partners, with our family of origin, with our friends. And the reality is, it can impact those relationships big time, And so it doesn't mean you don't do it, but it does mean, is there a place where you can be around women who are in that arena, who are stepping into the fullness of who they are and navigating what the impact that has in navigating some of those conversations. So I think that has absolutely been critical to be inside a supportive community like that. I have definitely found that how critical it is for me to be a part of something like that and also to provide.
Yeah, you really made a very interesting point there, that how often people are attached to who a woman was, and they do tend to be more attached to who a man can be, right?
Yes,
So that there's an innate, we all want, the women in our lives, our moms, so often we want them to stay the same. We don't want them to
totally.
change,
Yep.
right? Very, very interesting point. Well, I love the work that you're doing. I love your philosophies on business. I think we really connect that way. But I really like that you have, set forth a mission for yourself to really support women business leaders and women business owners. And I congratulate you for that. It's really, very well done.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, I would love to leave you with our final question, which is, what's one thing about you that says everything about you?
It's how I show up at sports games as a sports fan. So I'm a mega sports fan. Loud, supportive, all in, will lose my voice, get really into it, get into the players' stories. And I think it's how I am as everything. So, really doing deep research around things that are meaningful to me, showing up full in, being competitive, loving people who are demonstrating and playing with lots of fire in their gut, loving the feel and flow of a game. I tend to think of business as sort of a game as well. And that's really like the way that I am. You really see me, I think, in my kind of most natural state
I love
as
that.
a sports
The
fan.
way I show up at sports is the way I show up in the world. I can see that. I love that. So, Eleanor, tell us more about how we can be in touch with you, find out more about the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you. Well, if you like podcasts, you might enjoy the Power Presence Position podcast, and you can learn more about me and my work on my website, eleanorbeaton.com.
Awesome. And of course, we'll make sure those links are available on our show notes as well at jeffreyshaw.com/podcast. So you can always hop over there. But I do suggest you keep an eye on what Eleanor is up to. Eleanor, thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure.
Awesome. Remember, you may be in business for yourself, but you are not in business by yourself. Be your best self, be proud, and keep changing the world.